Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 43, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. We are right in the thick of summer. We've had a week, at least, of 90 plus degree temperatures, and it looks like we'll be having a little bit more of that before things possibly cool down a little bit. Typically, we don't get a lot of rain in July and August, and our fire danger goes way up. So everyone's a little bit on edge because of that. The garden is doing really well as long as I keep things watered. I've got a lot of garter snakes in my garden. One morning I was out there and I counted 4 of them. So they like to hide under the black plastic, and then they come out when it warms up. So every time I'm out there around 9 o'clock in the morning, I'll catch sight of 1 or 2 of them. They don't bother me. I'm happy that they're out there eating the bugs. I only get about an hour or 2 in the morning to work when it's still cool. So I go out and do all of my garden chores, and then I come back in and I've been sewing. I made some quilted pouches. And yesterday I resurrected a quilt project that I started a couple of months ago. It's called Fat Quarter Fancy Star. And I'll put a link to the pattern. It's a free pattern on the So Can She website. I'll put a link to that pattern. I'm making it out of green fabrics for the prints and some white and cream colored fabrics for the background. I'll do my housekeeping at the beginning of the podcast this week. I'm going to be traveling, so it's quite possible that there may not be a podcast next week. Also, I need a week off in the middle of the summer just to kind of regroup and figure out where I'm going from here. So fear not, the podcast will continue. I have more interviews lined up, but I'm going to take a week off and let things settle a bit. When I get back from traveling, I'll be teaching 2 classes. I'm teaching a class at our local quilt store on the Declique top. That's the top that I made for myself. I've made 2 of those, and I wear them just almost every other day. I've got one on. They're in the wash, and I'm wearing them because it's so hot and they're so cool. And in the middle of next week, I'll be heading down to Missoula to teach a class on thread. I do a 3-hour in-depth class on thread where the students get to try out several different kinds of threads that are provided by Wonderfill. I'm a Wonderfill educator, and that's a class that I've really enjoyed teaching. I've done it twice now. Thank you to everyone who has left reviews at Apple Podcasts or sent fan mail. I'm sorry I can't respond to the fan mail. There's no way for me to do that from the Buzzsprout website, and I hope that they add that in the future. If you'd like a response, it's probably best to email me, and that email is janet@janetszabo.com. You can also go to my website, www.janetszabo.com. There are links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website there and to my blog. I've been putting up pictures from the garden and pictures of my sewing projects there. The podcast has a website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com, and that is where you can find the show notes with links to things that get mentioned on the podcast episodes. So check all of those resources out if you're looking for something specific. And with that, I think I'm going to jump right into today's topic. I don't have a podcast interview today. What I thought I would talk about is, why do we sew? And this was inspired partly because I was thinking back to a workshop that my husband attended about 35 years ago when we first got married. He was interested in timber framing, and he found a workshop in Vermont or New Hampshire. I can't remember specifically where it was, but it was being hosted by a fairly famous timber framer who had written a book, and I think we owned the book. So he traveled up there for a week one summer and took this timber framing workshop. And when he got home, I asked him how he felt about it. Did he enjoy himself? And he said that he really enjoyed learning about timber framing, but he kind of snorted and said, well, in the evenings, we all sat around the fire and talked about the philosophy of timber framing. And if you know my husband at all, you know that he is a man of action. He is not one to sit around engaging in navel gazing. And he makes fun of me sometimes. We have what we call philosophy seminars over breakfast where Janet asks these deep, imponderable questions because I like to ask big questions. So I do a little bit more navel gazing than he does. But he didn't think that that was very valuable to sit around the fire in the evening talking about the philosophy of timber framing. He wanted to be out there doing the timber framing. So I was thinking about that for some reason the other day, and I thought, well, that makes me wonder, why do people sew? And I sat down and I made a list, and this list is in no particular order, but we'll go through and talk about each of these items. And if you have any suggestions, or maybe I missed something, maybe there's a reason that you sew that I didn't cover, feel free to let me know. Give feedback, leave a comment. So we'll start off with the first one, which is to save money. I think people historically have sewn to save money. There was a period of time where custom clothing was far too expensive for the average person to afford, and so most people did their own sewing. Nowadays, thanks to fast fashion, it's actually more expensive to sew your own clothing than it is to go to the store and buy it. Although you can get around that to a certain extent by shopping at thrift stores, picking up fabric there, or upcycling existing clothing and customizing it, or turning it into something else. So there are ways to save money by making your own clothing. But if you're going to buy $20 a yard rayon spandex fabric and make yourself a knit top, you're probably right up there with what it would cost if you went to TJ Maxx or Kohl's or some other store like that. And I'm not going to get into the political and socioeconomic reasons for that, other than to say that I don't think fast fashion has done us any favors. Another way to think of it is to say to yourself, if I'm making myself a quality garment that I'm going to have for 5 or 10 years even, then yes, I am saving money because I don't have to repeatedly buy that item when it wears out. I don't know about you, but I've had pieces of clothing that have only lasted maybe one summer because after a while they just fall apart in the wash. So if you take the time to find quality fabric and make something that will be a staple piece in your wardrobe, then you have saved money. Sewing is still very much a legit way to save money. The second reason that people sew is because it provides them a creative outlet. I know that my mother sewed a lot of our clothes when we were kids, and perhaps she was doing that to save money. That was how she was raised. She and her sisters made a lot of their own clothing, and my mother made a lot of our clothing when we were growing up. She made Barbie doll outfits for us. She made us Raggedy Ann dolls. For my mother, I think there was a certain element of creativity. My mother has always been very creative. She knit. She did a lot of counted cross stitch. She embroidered. She sewed. I think she was almost a little bit excited during the pandemic when she got to make masks, because really the only thing that she's used her sewing machine for in the past couple of decades is hemming pants. So it was nice to see that she was getting back into that creative flow. And sewing today offers so many different ways for people to be creative. You can do English paper piecing, you can make bags, you can quilt, you can make clothing. Our local quilt store offers so many classes that I think it would be possible to take a class virtually every single day of the month. Sewing offers infinite ways to be creative. No matter who you are or what your interests, you can express that through sewing. Along with sewing being a creative outlet, sewing can be a form of stress relief. Although when you're sitting there with a seam ripper in your hand, having to take out a seam for the third time, it may not feel very relaxing, but when you are in the zone and when things are flowing, sewing can be very relaxing. I think we all have a need to create. I think that's innate in us. And I think that we all need to find ways that we can relieve the stress of the world. And sewing lets us combine those two things in one activity. And usually we have something to show for it at the end. So unlike something like playing tennis or another physical activity that you might do for stress relief, sewing lets you relieve stress and produce something of beauty or value or usefulness. Perhaps you sew as a form of service to others. I belong to a Mennonite church here in Kalispell, and the Mennonites are big on service. Mennonite Central Committee hosts relief sales around the country, and the one that's closest to me is in Ritzville, Washington. It's held the first Saturday in October, and as part of the relief sale, there is a huge quilt auction, and the proceeds from the quilt auction go to help people around the world in places where there are specific needs. And I've made and donated quilts to that quilt auction. We also have the Mennonite Disaster Service, where groups of Mennonites go to places around the country where there have been natural disasters like fires or floods, and they rebuild houses for people in those areas. And one of the traditions that we have is that MDS presents a quilted wall hanging to the homeowner at the end of the project. So when the homeowner is ready to move back into their new home, they get a quilted wall hanging. And my friend Margaret, who is now 95 and lives in Goshen, Indiana, she and several other women in our sewing group at our church used to make wall hangings to donate to MDS. Maybe you make blankets for Project Linus. Maybe you make quilts of valor. Maybe it's some other service project that you do that involves sewing, and that's important to you, and that's a way for you to give back to your community, so that's why you sew. Sewing is a way to make money. I did this for many years as a knitting designer. I designed and published over 100 knitting patterns and wrote 3 books. So maybe you want to be a sewing designer. Maybe you want to design handbags. Maybe you want to design clothing. Maybe you want to design quilts. Maybe you want to be a fabric designer. That's a way for you to monetize your sewing and create an income stream for yourself by publishing patterns. Another way to make money is to produce items for sale. I belong to a local craft cooperative, and we have a big sale, a 2-day sale every September. And I can tell you that the women in that sewing group, we don't have any men so far, but the women in that sewing group are incredibly productive. And I've been able to see, because we have a weekly get-together on Thursdays, what people have been making for market and making to sell. And the variety is just incredible. Quilts, definitely. We do have a lot of quilts, but some people make modern quilts. Some people make more traditional quilts. Some people like to make home dec items like placemats or table runners. My contribution is usually pot holders and aprons because I enjoy making those and they sell pretty well. The pot holders always sell really well. Everybody needs a pot holder if you're going to cook. I have another friend who lives in Tennessee, and she sews items for to sell at farmers markets, and she does really well there. She also makes aprons and bowl cozies, and she's just started making some embroidered sweatshirts that are selling really well. Making items to sell either on Etsy or at farmers markets or at something like our craft co-op sale is another way to monetize your sewing and start an income stream for yourself. Some people have chosen to start YouTube channels, and the really, really successful YouTube channels like Tomcat Stitchery have monetized their sewing in that form and created that kind of an income stream for themselves. Some sewists have established Patreon accounts. Sherry McConnell has a Patreon account, and these Patreon accounts provide special perks to Patreon members. Social media has offered a lot of new ways to monetize things, and sewing is no exception. Maybe you sew because you like to give gifts to people. For a while, when I was a bit younger, handmade gifts had something of a stigma. I remember that one year my sister made me a collection of handmade Christmas ornaments. She had taken the globe ornaments that you can buy in a store, and she decorated them. My sister's very artistic. And I remember that when she gave them to me for Christmas, she apologized and she said, "I'm sorry, I don't have any money. I made you a present." And to this day, when I put up a Christmas tree and put those Christmas ornaments on it, I think of my sister. So for me, that handmade gift had a tremendous amount of value. I do know that, however, sometimes it is viewed as being cheap or being inconsiderate when nothing could be further from the truth. Someone who slaves over a project for weeks to make a quilt for someone or a baby blanket or anything, basically, that shows that they really care enough about that person to spend the time and the money making something special. Of course, you may want to think about the recipient and think about what they would like. Think about how they might treat the gift that you give them. We have a woman in our sewing group who tells the story of making one of her nieces a beautiful embroidered quilt for a wedding present, and the niece and her husband ended up getting divorced, and my friend found out that the dog was sleeping on this quilt that she had made for them. So she took it back and restored it to as best she could because it had been damaged a little bit. So, it's worth considering, is the person that you're giving this gift to going to value the time and effort that you put into it? Or are they going to let the dog sleep on your quilt? This next one is kind of near and dear to my heart. It's probably the main reason I took up sewing. It's not the only reason I took up sewing. When I stopped knitting in 2010, because I was just so burnt out, I still wanted to be in a textile activity, although I knew next to nothing about garment sewing. So I actually started by moving from knitting to quilting. As I mentioned, I belong to a Mennonite church, and we have just some tremendously talented quilters in our congregation, and they were more than happy to mentor me and teach me what I needed to know. And quilting was a way for me to indulge in sewing without having to worry about things fitting properly. I quilted for a while, and eventually it got to the point where I felt like I needed to learn how to make garments. I needed to learn fitting. I'm taller than average. I'm not excessively tall, but I'm taller than the average American woman. And virtually everything in the stores these days is too short for me. I've also got some fitting challenges. I have a long torso. I've also got a high hip curve, which means that the widest part of my hips isn't 9 inches below my waist, which is where they tell you to measure your hips. Mine, the widest part of my hips are about 4 or 5 inches below my waist. And that makes finding pants that fit a bit difficult. When we had this rash of low-rise clothing, I was just miserable because low-rise pants do not stay on my body. There is nothing to hold them up because that's not where the widest part of my hips are. I moved from quilting over to garment sewing. I still quilt. I do a lot of things. I make bags. I quilt. But I needed to learn garment sewing and fitting because that was the only way I could get things that fit my body. I also have winter coloring. I have very dark hair and pale skin, and I look best in bright jewel tone colors. And for so long, it has just been muddy earth tones everywhere. I can't do burgundy brown or navy blue. I want hot pink and emerald green. I think a lot of women, especially these days, are discovering garment sewing for themselves because ready-to-wear clothing isn't intended to custom fit a particular body. It's made to general measurements, and your body may have some fitting challenges. I can even think of specific instances where you may need adaptive clothing. When I was 28 and I had leukemia and I was getting chemotherapy, I had a port in my chest, which is how they hooked up the IV to deliver the chemotherapy. And it was very difficult to find clothing that made it easy to access that port. So if you're someone who is undergoing chemotherapy and you need access to that area of your body, nowadays you can go to Joann Fabrics and look at McCall's or Butterick or Simplicity, and they have adaptive clothing patterns to meet those kinds of needs. Perhaps you've had the same experience and that's why you sew. I will say that if I can learn fitting, as spatially challenged as I am, I think anybody can learn fitting. It's a bit of trial and error, which I know can be frustrating, but once it's dialed in, and making clothing that fits you and looks flattering is so satisfying and so rewarding. Sewing has changed quite a bit over the last, 1,000 years. It's gone from something that people had to do if they wanted to be covered up or warm, if they wanted to have blankets on their beds. It's gone from practical and humble beginnings to being the kind of creative outlet that allows for all sorts of personal expression. I didn't even mention cosplay. I'm mentioning it now. That's a whole new arena of creative expression for people. I'm curious, what does sewing mean to you? Why do you sew? These aren't mutually exclusive reasons. You might sew for many reasons. You might sew because you love quilting. You might sew because to make money. I became a knitting designer not only because I enjoyed it, but because it allowed me to be home with my kids when they were little. Maybe sewing is that for you. Maybe sewing allows you to create the kind of family and home life that you want by turning it into a business. Perhaps your reasons for sewing have evolved. Like mine, perhaps you started as a quilter and you moved into garment sewing. Perhaps you started as a quilter and you moved into machine embroidery. Perhaps you started as a garment sewist and discovered how much fun quilting can be. No one should be ashamed of the reasons that they sew. No one should feel less than somebody else because of the reasons. The bottom line is that you are engaging in a skilled craft. You are making something beautiful or useful or beautiful and useful. You are taking a flat piece of fabric and making it conform to someone's body in a flattering way. What could be more magical than that? It doesn't matter what you sew or why you sew, it only matters that you sew. This has been a little shorter than usual episode. I like to mix it up a bit, and we've had some long interview shows. As I said, I will probably take next week off just for a little bit of rest and relaxation, and because my teaching schedule is a bit crammed full. And maybe it'll give you the opportunity to catch up on some of the previous episodes if you haven't been keeping up with them. But until our next episode, I hope you have a great couple of weeks and that you get to go sew something.